Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are starting a new series on avoidant personality disorder. We have had a huge response to our Schizoid series, and multiple questions came up about the difference between schizoid and avoidant because there's a lot of overlap, and they have similar, if not the same, origins. So in this episode, we go through the DSM criteria for avoidant personality disorder, compare and contrast it to social anxiety disorder, and also share our unfiltered thoughts and skepticism about it as a diagnosis. We have a lot to cover as usual, so let's dive in.
Avoidant, coined by Milan in 1969, is an active aversion to social relationships, which contrasts with schizoid personality as a passive aversion to relationships. Now, prior to 1969, Milan notes that there were descriptions of what he believes to be avoidant, which mostly included mistrustful social styles and those with histories of extreme criticism in childhood.
Ooh.
And that is what he calls parental deprecation. Specifically, he mentioned Fairbairn's schizoid includes the mistrustful social style and history of disapproval from caregivers. So maybe like part of why schizoids turtle or have like a hard protective shell.
Okay. So these features also overlapped with Kohut's narcissistic personality, right? So in the mistrust that others will attack their image or ego, most likely in a way that happened early in childhood, though, with these hypercritical parents.
Exactly. But then otherwise, he starts his description of avoidant personality way later than other personality types.
Yes. And this is why we have mixed emotions about this personality, because its origins are much, much later than other personalities. And also it was coined at a time of heightened civil unrest in the United States. So we talk about this more at the end. We have a lot of opinions about it. So stay tuned if you think that's interesting.
Okay. But avoidant personality disorder wasn't introduced in the DSM until 1980, when schizoid personality disorder was split into schizoid, schizotypal, and avoidant. Since that split, though, theorists have been arguing, and they still are. Okay, so reading the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other in journals, because that's how they communicated at that time, it's so entertaining. Check out the American Journal of Psychiatry from about 1985 to 1989 for some lovely comic-filled reading.
Exactly. Yes. And the main argument here among these shrinks was how schizoid and avoidant were split up in the actual DSM. So one of the major critiques was that the DSM categories overlapped too much and were too vague to capture different disorders, which we actually don't disagree with that. But that also led to a deeper argument about whether schizoid and avoidant should conceptually be split up in general, which is the main point of contention among these earlier shrinks duking it out in the American Journal of Psychiatry, right? But with that said, let's hop to the DSM criteria that was so hotly debated.
So like any personality disorder, the DSM-5-TR notes it has to be lifelong, pervasive, and present in multiple environments and situations. So it's stable, it's enduring. It doesn't just randomly show up one day. For avoidant personality disorder specifically, the main patterns include social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation.
So social inhibition, meaning like socially restrained or holding back in relationships. So if you've been following along with our previous schizoid and schizotypal series, you'll notice that the social inhibition is part of all three: schizoid, schizotypal, and avoidant.
And then there has to be 4 or more of the following criteria. So the first criterion is avoids occupational activities that involve significant interpersonal contact because of fears of criticism, disapproval, or rejection.
So basically, work is influenced due to fears of negative evaluation, disapproval, or rejection, especially work that involves social interactions. So they attempt to avoid meaningful interpersonal contact in their job, even if it's important for the job's success or advancement. So, for example, they might turn down a promotion because they're fearful that failing to do a good job in the new position could result in others criticizing them. Their avoidance can seriously impact their job functioning. So that fear, not just of failing, but of what people will say, is fierce.
Right. You can hear the underlying insecurity and the need for social approval because criticism is that scary.
Exactly.
And that leads me to the second criterion, which is unwilling to get involved with people unless certain of being liked.
So that fear of what people will say or wanting others to view them positively is all encompassing, and they avoid new people unless they are very sure of approval and not rejection.
They have a foundational belief that others are critical, disapproving, and rejecting, and they are super aware and vigilant of watching others' movements and expressions. So then others need to pass tests and jump through hoops to shed that default assumption.
Which sounds exhausting, right? And this means that avoidants have a hard time making new friends and often avoid group activities. So they might become pretty isolated and don't often have bigger support networks, again, due to that fear.
Yes. Okay. And then we have the third criterion, which is shows restraint within intimate relationships because of the fear of being shamed or ridiculed. So because of the fears of being criticized or ridiculed or shamed, exposed, etc., intimacy is hard and troublesome. There's fear of getting too close. So avoidance might act with restraint, avoid talking about themselves, and not share their intimate feelings.
But if they feel safe and are super assured that they won't be judged or criticized, they can show interpersonal intimacy. Interestingly, I see this in the paranoid personality dynamics too, right? But conversely, because they actually do desire affection and acceptance from others, it can move to fantasy. So they might fantasize about idealized connections with others instead of actually engaging in them. So here is some of that overlap with schizoid, right? In resorting to fantasy.
This actually reminds me of an episode we did recently on When Paranoid Personalities Kill. And we talked about Timothy McVeigh.
Yes.
Because he had fantasies about being a superhero, which later developed into interest in the military and disillusionment with heroes. And then that led to a much bigger plot with the Oklahoma City bombings.
So interesting. Yeah. And I know that we're talking about avoidant here, but there is some overlap with paranoid and schizoid. Both, really. Like they have difficulty with intimate relationships and can resort to fantasy to get their needs met where it's safe and people don't hurt you.
Which then leads to criterion 4. So they are preoccupied with being criticized or rejected in social situations. So they think and worry about this constantly, which means they are always on alert for the possibility of criticism or rejection. And they can detect if someone is being like even the teensiest bit critical or disapproving.
Yeah.
So their threshold for picking that up is like super low. And then, of course, they feel extremely hurt.
Yeah. So they react strongly to even the most subtle cue that may suggest someone is mocking them or showing contempt.
And sometimes they misinterpret others like neutral gestures, statements, or responses as critical or rejecting, which in turn confirms their self-doubts, which is technically a confirmation bias.
Yeah. And in this way, avoidants have a hair trigger very similar to borderline personality, but borderlines are preoccupied with fear of abandonment and scan relationships for the slightest cue of being left behind. And they often create dynamics in which this fear is realized. For the avoidant, though, even the slightest whiff of criticism can set them off and lead to a counterattack or possibly withdrawal from the relationship. So both have hair triggers that can look incredibly similar, but for slightly different reasons. But basically, the avoidance reaction to critique is like a borderline's reaction to abandonment.
Yes, that is a great point. But also, what if the avoidance reaction to critique is parallel to the narcissistic reaction to ego hits, which could also be criticism?
Yep.
And this is where some of the early shrinks were debating, like, is there too much overlap with avoidant and other personalities?
This is such a good point. Yeah, because there's the narcissism overlap too, which again, this makes sense why this personality disorder is so debated. Just in talking about it, we can see those connections.
Absolutely. But let's go to the fifth criterion. So they're inhibited in new interpersonal situations because of feelings of inadequacy.
So because avoidants feel inadequate and have low self-esteem, they are not confident acting like themselves in new situations. They are afraid that no matter what they say or do, others will see them as wrong and flawed. So really, they tend to not say much, if anything. And then they fear and avoid any attention because it might be critical or rejecting. Thus, they come across as shy, timid, quiet, inhibited, lonely, isolated, and sometimes even invisible. So this hypersensitivity to rejection and low self-esteem lead to reduced social functioning and interactions, meaning that they may be hard to get to know.
However, they really do desire and yearn to be social and interpersonally active. They're just really scared to essentially put their psychological welfare in the hands of others.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah, yeah. So then that leads to a conflict of whether or not to put themselves out there or to stay isolated, right? And just enjoy the fantasies of socialization where it's safe. And here I'm also just thinking about this low self-esteem, this poor sense of self-worth. And that's really what sets the avoidance apart from schizoids. So schizoids often have a cohesive sense of who they are, and their self-esteem is less contingent, or often not at all contingent, on the appraisal from others.
Yes, that's actually a really good point. And that brings me to the next criterion. So criterion 6 is that they view the self as socially inept, personally unappealing, or inferior to others. So for some avoidants, their belief that they are socially incompetent and personally unattractive can be most intense when interacting with strangers. But for many other avoidants, they have more difficulty with repetitive interactions because it leads to like an increased expectation of sharing personal information. And then that increases the risk that any of their flaws or inferiority might be seen, which means they could be criticized or rejected.
And this here is really sad. So to feel like you don't have something to bring to the table in relationships, like that's tragic. Right? Like this core belief of not being enough runs really, really deep. So in therapy, I would be asking, like, where did you learn this message?
Yeah, and that kind of pairs up with the initial conceptualization of avoidance having highly critical parents. Like not just invalidating parents, but critical ones that become an introject. So an introject is like when we absorb an external stimulus into the self, so it becomes part of us in our psyche, like it's one with the psyche. So the critical parent's voice becomes one with the avoidant and their core sense of identity.
Yes, the introject. Yes. So then a core building block of their character is what you're saying is feelings of ineptitude, sometimes because of upbringing and being reinforced in that way.
Yeah, and I think this is where avoidant gets closer to maybe phobic characters in neuroses because they suppress their own needs and impulses and self so that they don't get criticized.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that belief about the self is so strong. It's integral to the psyche.
Yeah. And then with that, as ongoing interpersonal commitments, either social or work related, start requiring the repetitive interactions, avoidants might start to convince themselves over time that others are seeing them as valueless and inferior.
Oh, wow.
And then that leads to distress that's not tolerable. and or anxiety that leads to evading others or maybe even quitting.
And I can see how this cycle of quitting jobs, right, and starting a new one could really exacerbate these fears and really make more conflict. Like, I can't stay in this job because they see me for my faults and ineptitude. But to get a new job is to put myself out there again and risk being seen as incompetent or not enough.
Yes. And there absolutely can be a history of repeated job changes.
Yeah.
That's actually a major theme. The biggest outward problems involved with avoidant is difficult social and work functioning.
And I can see how that could lead to a stuck point of unemployment in severe cases, because going through the interview process where you're putting your best self out there, showcasing your strengths, right? Like, that's not going to come naturally to the avoidant. And the fear of rejection at the interview or criticism can be enough to keep the individual from keeping a stable job.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the last criterion. So criterion 7 is there's unusual reluctance to take personal risks or to engage in any new activities because they may prove embarrassing. So they are actually likely to exaggerate the potential dangers of ordinary situations, which basically just means that they can be super anxious in a way that's out of proportion to the actual event.
Yeah, like a job interview, a date, maybe new social interactions, right? So this results in a lifestyle that is restricted because they have high needs for security, assurance, and certainty. But as we know, life is full of risks and unknowns. So this can lead to missing out on really cool opportunities that would help them feel more positively about themselves. So then what we have here is this negatively reinforcing cycle where the avoidant doesn't feel confident enough to do something, which then just fuels the fear that they're not good enough because good experiences, relationships, jobs, etc., don't come their way because they have a hard time putting themselves out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's what the DSM says about the criteria. But it also highlights interesting things in the development and course of avoidant personality disorder.
Ooh, let's go there.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So there are points in development where shyness and social withdrawal and stranger danger fears that lead to avoidant behavior are appropriate. So early childhood, middle childhood, sometimes even adolescence. But the difference is that it subsides over time as a youth gets older and enters adulthood. Now, in contrast, for those with avoidant personalities, the shyness, fears, withdrawal, they increase in severity with age, coming to a head in adulthood, which is interesting because that's kind of when we start seeing a focus on forming intimate relationships with others, creating families of their own, and arguably when most people start working full time.
This makes so much sense. Yeah. And then this developmental story arc is where you can see that personality disorders exist over time, right? Because personality disorders don't just come out of nowhere. Sometimes at disorder level functioning, the individual seems to get stuck in a developmental stage from way earlier in childhood. So not growing out of these quirks can be an indicator of more going on. So something else, though, that's important to point out is that many people have traits of avoidant personality. We've talked a little bit about how it overlaps with schizoid, borderline, paranoid, narcissistic, etc. But per the DSM, an avoidant trait is at full-blown personality disorder level when it's pervasive, enduring, and inflexible. So it's going to cause major life disruption and impairment in relationships and at work.
Exactly. The DSM also notes that there's a ton of overlap between avoidant and social anxiety. Yeah. And social anxiety is decently common. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't remember exactly who, but some theorists suggested that social anxiety is an ego dystonic syndrome and avoidant personality disorder is an ego syntonic syndrome. What does that mean? So it means that social anxiety is outside of who the person is, while avoidant personality disorder is wrapped up in the identity and the interworkings of the person.
That is so interesting. So this is a really cool way to think about it. Like, is the dysfunction one with the person or not? Similarly, some theorists say that avoidant personality disorder is a more severe form of social anxiety disorder. But while I think there's some overlap personally, like I think social anxiety can be part of avoidant personality disorder, I do see some distinct differences here too.
Yes, there are differences between social anxiety and avoidant personality, especially in relation to self-concept. Avoidant personality disorder involves pervasive, entrenched, low self-esteem and feelings of inferiority, while social anxiety simply involves maybe sometimes feeling negatively about the self, but also sometimes not. The insecurity is not all encompassing. It is not part of the whole person.
Yeah. Good point. So then, according to the DSM, avoidant personality disorder can occur without social anxiety disorder. So it's not necessarily a pathway of severity or even a prerequisite. Like, there are also risk factors that increase the chances of developing social anxiety, and then different risk factors that increase the chances of developing avoidant personality disorder. So this suggests that they are two separate disorders. Anyway, let's talk about what social anxiety disorder is for a minute so that we can understand the overlap.
Okay, so social anxiety is extreme fear in social situations where they are potentially being evaluated or scrutinized by others. So, for example, new social interactions, eating or drinking in public, giving a speech, taking a test. The fear is about a negative evaluation from others. It's less about a personal feeling of ineptitude or inadequacy, but more so that their performance or social interaction will be embarrassing, humiliating, offensive to others, or maybe lead to rejection from peers.
Yeah, so the fear isn't just random or inconsistent, but it's experienced consistently during social situations. Social situations are either avoided, or if they're unable to be avoided, they are experienced with intense fear and anxiety. But this fear is out of proportion to the actual situation, and it has to last for 6 months or more, and it needs to cause significant distress or impairment in their ability to function.
Right. And it's not due to substances, another medical condition, or another mental disorder like panic disorder, body dysmorphia, or autism. It can also be performance only if the fear is restricted to speaking or performing in public.
Right. Yeah. So the overlap here between social anxiety and avoidant personality is that both put the emphasis on others' feedback, right? But that feedback or fear of a certain type of feedback is what triggers the anxiety in these types, which leads to avoiding situations or people where that fear could come to life. For the socially anxious, it might be avoiding giving that speech in speech class, or for the avoidant, not applying for that promotion for fear of criticism about them as an employee.
So the key difference between them is that in social anxiety, the individual is more so afraid that their performance or the social interaction will reveal something that is not actually true about them as a person. So for example, if they can't make the grade, it means they're not a good student. Or if someone said something embarrassing, it means you're a bad person. Their anxiety about their performance isn't related to a negative self-appraisal. In avoidant, it's almost like their fear is being discovered as inept, which confirms their self-view, meaning that any inkling of perceived criticism means that they're outed. So socially anxious individuals still care about the evaluation of others, but not because they're trying to hide feelings of ineptitude.
Right. It's almost the opposite, that they're afraid it's going to reveal something about them that's not true. Like you said, like, oh, I must be a bad student if I can't make the grade. But it's not like they believe that about themselves. It's not like one with their identity.
You got it.
Yeah. So super helpful to distinguish. So thank you for bringing that up, Doc Fish. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about our unfiltered thoughts about avoidant. I know we got into this in another episode, a few ones back on schizoid versus avoidant, but I think we do need to talk about that a little bit here. So, Doc Fish, what are your unfiltered thoughts about avoidant personality disorder.
Oh boy. All right. Well, honestly, avoidant personality disorder confuses me.
Yeah.
Why? Because it overlaps too much with other things. And I think maybe it might fit better into the anxious, avoidant, phobic, psychodynamic personality, but I'm also not 100% sold on that either. So avoidance, in my experience, like they do seem more neurotic rather than borderline or psychotic. And their fear is of being seen as inadequate, which is technically not even something that develops until like age 3. Like a 3-year-old is essentially when you start developing embarrassment. So before 3, you can't, like they don't understand embarrassment. Anyway, so neurotic, that is like the core wound starts around age 3 or 6. Borderline or psychotic is before that. So like I feel like it fits in the neurotic box, which is the phobic character and psychodynamic. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. And then there's a flavor of narcissism in hiding and protecting the ego.
Oh.
There's a flavor of schizoid and like the social inhibition and fantasy, a flavor of borderline because of that like chase dodge dynamic. And I would say a decently strong flavor of paranoid in their fear that others are dangerous due to others' capacity to reject or criticize them.
Yeah. I'm hearing you here, Doc Fish. This is really interesting. And I do think that there's a hidden underbelly of narcissism here. It's more of a vulnerable side to it, but it's still a pop of color to this personality, to the avoidant personality. And I do see what you're saying. There's a lot of overlap with other personality types. And actually, as you were talking, it reminded me of the Enneagram. So the Enneagram is another classification system. We won't get into all the ins and outs of that, but just real quick, as a nugget for those of you who know the Enneagram, the avoidant sounds to me like the unhealthy side of the Enneagram 6, which is this more fearful personality type in this classification system.
Okay, so that is exactly what I was thinking. Because okay, the 6 is a fearful type. They desire support, but then it neighbors the 7, which is like kind of narcissistic-y.
It can be.
And the 5, which can be very schizoid-ish, that's like 2 of the things that overlaps or like the pops of flavor. And then counterphobic 6s are like, they're 6s, but they go against the grain. So they are still fearful, but they run towards fear.
Yes. As a way to beat it.
Yeah. And they can, if really, really unhealthy, they can be on the track to paranoid.
Right.
So that makes me think maybe a 6. Anyway.
No, I appreciate your input here. Yeah. And then also what you brought up about going back to like developmental stages and all of that. And that is all important to the function of the psyche and the personality. But with the Enneagram specifically, like I'm just thinking about like this is the head center of functioning. We're talking about 5, 6, and 7, and being prone to withdrawal or even self-absorption into fantasy or maybe some grandiosity there too. So I think that there's something here. But anyway, this is just a little nugget for our listeners and viewers who are avid Enneagram fans. But let us know in the comments if you guys would want a series on Enneagram. There's really a lot to unpack. That's a whole different fascinating, awesome classification system that we love. But it is a lot to get into. And I don't want to lose people in explaining all of it because it's so much. But if you are interested, let us know because we can go there, but you need to let us know that we should go there.
We can open the nerdy box.
Right. Okay. Pandora's box.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, Doc Bach, what do you actually think of avoidant personality disorder?
Yeah. I'm not too far off of where you are with this, Doc Fish. But the piece that stands out to me is like, why in the world were we so stinking late to the game in naming avoidant personality disorder, and specifically the 1960s, right? Spawning from schizoid, they split them up. But like 1960s was a time of massive civil unrest. There was global distress. It was the civil rights movement here in the States. Like racial tensions were at a boiling point. President JFK was assassinated. I mean, like there were so many things in the 60s that people were on edge, and there was a time of rising up too. So as I said before in our other episode where we talked about this, like if we were to dip a ladle from the personality soup into the zeitgeist of that time, like would more fearful personalities come up in that ladle? I think they would. So kind of similar to now, like if we were to take a ladle full of dysfunctional personalities, like right now in this post-pandemic time frame, I think we would see different flavors than we would had we taken a ladle back in 1990. Like there has to be longevity, and will this personality withstand the test of time? Like that's the question in my head here. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So that actually kind of reminds me of how hysterical personality was coined during a time of female sexuality suppression.
Mm-hmm.
Or paranoid personality really popped up and increased with the recent pandemic. So there is stuff that's related to the social world.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Personality is definitely correlated with the social world. But again, like some stuff withstands the test of time and generations, like narcissism, for example. I mean, hello, we have that. There's examples of that in the Bible, for goodness sake. Or if you just look across the centuries, there's been grandiose characters or narcissistic characters, like among others. There's other personality styles that also withstand the test of time, but that sticks out to me as like one of the most significant ones. But would avoidant withstand the test of time? And then that leads me to the question, what if it is just a trait? Right?
Ooh.
Yeah. So a trait that maybe you can turn the volume up, and it could exist in any personality disorder, maybe at varying levels, but especially if there's disordered level personality, maybe they're more prone to having that volume knob turned up. So again, similar to narcissism. So narcissism is also a trait. It's also kind of one of the first ingredients in all the major personality disorders. So if you're making a personality cookie, so to speak, your narcissism is going to be the flour in the recipe. Like, you got to have it. It's going to be there. So avoidant maybe is like your chocolate chips or your raisins or whatever you put in your cookies. Like maybe there can be a pop of color there that gives more texture to the dysfunction. But yeah, again, I think maybe there's like a volume button that goes up and down depending on the personality disorder. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but
yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that could be a very real possibility. I'll have to sit with that a little more. Yeah.
Yeah. So then the last thing that comes to mind for me is I am skeptical about Milan. And as much as we love him, he is a awesome personality theorist, in our opinion, one of the greatest of all times, if not the greatest of all time. I can't help but wonder if his ego got in the way here, because if I recall, he needed a personality to contrast against Schizoid, right?
Active and passive. Yep. He needed an active.
And I can't help but wonder, like, did he make this up? Like, he seemed really convinced of it, and maybe he was. But he had a lot of pushback about it. A lot of people arguing with him in the journals, and not just there, but also in the DSM task force. So the task force that is designed to basically say, do we keep this in the DSM or do we not? Like a group of researchers and shrinks that get together. And there was a lot of pushback, right? Like not everyone was thrilled about it becoming a personality disorder. And he was telling them to sit down and they didn't know what they were talking about.
Right. There was a lot of controversy and arguing about it being a separate disorder. So it is super interesting to read their discussions and passive aggressiveness about it. So
yeah,
that's
definitely
also a possibility. Yeah.
So it was hotly debated, and I see why, because I'm still on the fence about it. And maybe in this series, I'll come to a different conclusion, as will you, Doc Fish, as we're getting into the research, getting our hands dirty, looking at where this came from and is it real, and kind of up against our clinical experience. But I mean, with clinical experience, I have diagnosed it. Like,
Yeah, me
I
too.
have technically seen patients that check the boxes in the DSM, right? But typically when I do diagnose it, there's more textures and layers and colors to their personality that diagnosis alone doesn't capture.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Anyway, that's where I'm at. I'm sus. I'm sus on this one.
You're sus. I hear you. I am also skeptical. I am.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say here is if you're interested in hearing more about this, check out our Avoidant versus Schizoid episode, because we do go into more in depth about our opinions here and what the research says. So I will link that in the show notes. But so for today, we learned about avoidant personality disorder according to the DSM, how it's different from schizoid, and our skepticism surrounding this diagnosis. So we hope that you'll tune in for the rest of this series. So don't forget to like, subscribe, give us a shout. We've also got blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. But on that note, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us today on this episode. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on the Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.